دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a beautiful day. Welcome to ITV Networks, to Finding Me on the ITV Networks, and my very special guest, a very good friend and a colleague, Joel Modiri, who's a lecturer at the University of Pretoria in the Department of Jurisprudence. Joel has recently successfully defended his PhD, focusing on the work of Steve Biko, the thought of Steve Biko, and trying to apply that in terms of a South African context related to critical race relations and critical race structures. And of course, through all of that is the big question on the decolonization of knowledge or decoloniality. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, Joel. Thank you for being here and making this time.
Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to have you back. It's been many years since we did that very first interview.
I believe so, yes. I was one of the early people.
Yeah, and we started to stir the waters at that time
that's
already.
That's right.
So we've come a long way, Joel, and we've had the last 2 years have been rather traumatic, very tense, and I think emotionally straining and draining on many academics as well, considering the extensive surveillance in terms of the academic structures, looking at how academics function or what they're doing, etc. And in spite of all that, we have to continue with the work. The work has to go on. The project of decoloniality and decolonization of the university has to go on. And for that, you chose an amazing topic, and that is on Steve Biko. Tell us a little bit about your thesis and how this impacted on you at a time when actually momentous changes were happening.
Well, thanks. That's a very nice way to start. So I guess the work that I do, or the project that I'm trying to engage in, does see the university and the academy as a site of struggle. So the struggles aren't just happening on the streets. They're happening in universities, because universities are a microcosm of the society and the country. And South African universities have a number of quite critical problems. The central problem being a problem we might call epistemic racism, right? Which is the inequality in how different knowledges are valued in the university. So the project that I chose is tentatively, well, no longer tentatively, in its future iterations it won't have this name anymore, but it's titled The Jurisprudence of Steve Biko. And basically I'm trying to apply or engage or reflect on the thinking of the Black consciousness movement, specifically in the writings of Steve Biko himself, and apply those to law, jurisprudence and human rights. But it might be important to say that I locate this work, this project, in what we might call the Azanian political tradition. So this is a tradition that distinguishes itself from the dominant African National Congress tradition known as a Charterist tradition. And so there are a few things that I think are important with that. The first aspect of this Azanian tradition is that it sees South Africa itself, the name but also the territory, as really the product of a 4th-century struggle over land, right? So South Africa, as we know, it is really an artifact of conquest. It comes into being through the dynamics of European racism and the attempts of European settlers to control and dominate native life, not simply politically, economically, legally, but most importantly, culturally and psychically.
So it's almost totalitarian in a way.
Well, Steve Biko uses the phrase the totality of white power, and that's precisely what he's trying to get at. He's trying to say white power in South Africa operates in a manner that has to be comprehensive, total and far-reaching. It can't simply be political and legal power, but it's also socio-economic, cultural and psychic power, and this was of course quite central for a figure like Steve Biko. So that's the first part of the Azanian tradition. South Africa itself is a politically contested formation. Okay, it can't be taken for granted. So when they speak of a future Azania, they mean it is not a metaphor. Azania is not a metaphor. It's a term of struggle to turn this country into a place for its indigenous people to live ethically and a dignified life, which is not what's happening at the moment. So that's the first part of it.
And I can just imagine the resistance to it.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. And of course, the Azanian tradition is both in conflict with what we might call all of white power, but it's also in conflict with the dominant ANC ruling elite.
With this liberatory
with that liberatory narrative, okay? Because the other thing that the Azanian political tradition in post-1994 would do is to raise questions about the 1994 moment. And its central argument would be what we've had here has been a transformation in how white power works, has been a reconfiguration, a reorganizing, a concealing of colonial apartheid relations, but not an abolition or a fundamental transformation of them.
So no change in actual structures.
No, so the subtitle of my doctorate is The Afterlife of Colonial Apartheid. So not the aftermath, it's not that it's over and we're just dealing with the leftovers, the afterlife. In other words, it's living on but in a new form.
Right.
And the object
so
of
actually a continuation of the old.
Absolutely, it's a reproduction and a continuation. So the object of my study is to try and give content to what this afterlife is. And other people use other phrases. Some people say neo-apartheid South Africa. Some people say post-apartheid South Africa. So to say, even though apartheid has formally ended, apartheid relations and apartheid systems and apartheid mindsets and logics are still in play. So that's what the project is really trying to do, to revive this Azanian political tradition. The other thing that this Azanian political tradition does is that it thinks about racism as white supremacy. So it does not, it focuses on the only racism that we know to have historically and politically matured and developed in South Africa, and that is white supremacy. Okay, so when you think of things like equality legislation and anti-discrimination legislation, this and the hate crimes bill, for example, that's being proposed in South Africa, this emphasis on individual racists is highly problematic, given that South Africa itself is an artifact of racism in the first place. But secondly, racism is structural rather than individual.
Interpersonal also.
Right, or interpersonal. So it doesn't matter whether an individual white person is racist. What matters is that we live in a society that produces racist outcomes. So there's another important thing we get out of the Azanian political tradition, out of Biko's understanding of racism as discrimination for the purposes of subjugation. Basically, the argument famously known as blacks can't be racist, right? That racism is a specific historical political form. As we always remind people, black people can obviously be very mean to white people. They could very well hate. They could be discriminatory to white people. They could very well hate white people, and there would be a good number of historical reasons for such a reaction. But that is not racism. That is maybe prejudice and so forth. But racism needs to define a very specific kind of reality of injustice and domination in South Africa. So these are some of the things that the study is trying to think law through.
And it's basically an infrastructure of subordination, isn't it?
Yeah.
That you're trying to work through.
Yeah.
And how to tackle that and how to come up with solutions. So very radical thought, a very conflicting argument, I think, in terms of the current political climate. I mean, problematic for many who want to continue with the status quo, and the university being one of that. So in fleshing out these particular arguments, looking at the macro context, which would be South Africa, the state per se, and the micro context would be the university, you can bring that down to the context of the university. How do you then see this fight for decolonization of the university and decoloniality in terms of knowledge?
Okay. My project doesn't work through decoloniality. Decoloniality is one of many important traditions that are thinking about what it means to decolonize. The very aim of my project was to try and say that we have in black consciousness and in the Pan-Africanist Congress an indigenous critical race theory and an indigenous tradition of decolonization, and that we need to start here. But of course, all these critical traditions of the global south, if we call them, are very important for thinking about decolonization. So two things are important there. Another thing that we get out of the Black Consciousness Movement, you remember that the Black Consciousness Movement inherits from the PAC and from Anton Lembede's ANC Youth League the notion of self-determination, which is the idea that the oppressed not only can think for themselves, but must think for themselves. They have to produce from their own culture, their own history, and their own experience forms of knowledge that they can use as tools of liberation. So what we get out of this understanding, and then in the Black Consciousness Movement, of course, it's the idea of non-collaboration with whites. Right. In other words, it's saying black people don't have to depend on elite powers, whether it's the state or international donors or white people, all of these elite powers. So the implication of that is also epistemic. Blacks have to think for themselves. They have to, as Cedric Robinson puts it, they have to adhere to the authority of their own experience. And what that means, amongst other things, is that in the university, Western and white epistemes, in other words, knowledges, perspectives, derived from the Western and white experience, derived from the historical dramas of European societies, derived from the anxieties and concerns of white South Africa, are limited tools for thinking about black liberation. So my project is absolutely about coming into confrontation with not only what we might call liberal traditions of Western thought like liberalism and others, but even the radical traditions like Marxism and so forth. They are limited in understanding the black and African experience of conquered people.
So anybody who knows a little bit about Biko and who is against toppling the status quo will then do everything possible to continue with ensuring that the university does not change, isn't it? Because if Biko's argument, and the black consciousness argument, is that black people need to think and think from their own tradition, then the idea is not to get them into that environment or give them access to that thinking, isn't it? Because at that point then, things start to change.
Absolutely. So, gatekeeping in the academy, in the university, and maybe anywhere where ideas are produced, is an ongoing phenomenon. Okay, people come into the university, they produce certain ideas, they build centers, institutes, departments, faculties, they become well known and famous for certain approaches, they get invited internationally because of those approaches. So there does come a time when they are challenged by a younger generation of scholars who are saying fundamentally, not just that they disagree with aspects of the thinking, but they're saying that fundamentally the whole way we've been thinking, in my case, about law, about jurisprudence, about human rights, is completely fundamentally wrong, and it's all from a white perspective. And that we have indigenous traditions to think about. So absolutely, this work is not a luxury, and it's not fun, and it's not easy to do, because there are certain academics and powerful professors and centers and institutes have an interest in making sure that we tell a certain story of South Africa and a certain story of the Constitution and a certain story of law.
It's like about how the victor writes history, right?
That's right.
Okay, but we have to go to a break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little further about that. We'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me today on the ITV networks with my very special friend and guest, Joel Modiri, and we're talking about Steve Biko's thought in a contemporary South Africa. Joel, you raised a very important point, and this is about how what is basically being produced in the university is gatekept, it's managed. And that comes especially, one sees it very often in the postgraduate level, when you're looking for supervisors, when you're looking for examiners, etc. When you write something or choose a topic that does not fit that particular portfolio or that particular framework, then the student encounters huge difficulties or is very often penalized. Sometimes administrative arguments are pushed forward that this doesn't fit into this particular faculty or this particular department, or that you need an additional supervisor or a co-supervisor, etc. Do you think things are going to change? How long will it carry on like this for black students especially, who are now engaging with this new kind of work that you're doing, to start breaking ground?
So I don't know when it will end. My understanding is that South Africa has for roughly 4 centuries been in the throes, of this process of European colonial domination. And that, in my understanding, that domination persists across social life in South Africa and plays out in the universities. There are very deep material and symbolic and psychic stakes, or there are symbolic interests at stake in this process of changing knowledges, because certain people's perspectives are no longer going to be dominant, and new perspectives are going to come into the university, and that's going to change the broader social thought structures, and that's going to challenge certain forms of power.
Yes.
It's going to challenge the privilege of white South Africans, for example. It's going to challenge the way we've been thinking about South African history, the privileged place, say, of the ANC in that history. So there are very serious interests at stake, and so that's why the history of a lot of Africanist or radical academics is that they've been mistreated in South African universities. I'm thinking immediately about people like Achima Feja and Mahmoud Mamdani, but I'm also thinking about people like Bernard Magubani, Jordan Gubani, the writings of Louis Nkosi and so forth about.
They haven't even been given any prominence in the universities.
They have not been given prominence, but the problem is when they are given prominence, it's often through the philanthropic sensibilities of some white academic who decides they're going to do the nice thing and bring this material in. So we have the first problem we have in the university, before I answer your question about how can we change this, is we just don't have enough black academics yet. So I think the first thing we need to say to black people is that we have a responsibility to teach our own children and teach the children of others.
Yes, exactly.
Right, and to honor the perspectives of our ancestors and the cultures and knowledges and ways of life of our ancestors and of people who've come before us, who've struggled in our name, who've died for us, and who are being erased from history. So we have to do the difficult work of recuperating lost histories. But to answer your question, another thing that Steve Biko says, which I interpret to be a call for responsibility, there's this line that it's a sin to allow yourself to be oppressed. Now, whether you're religious or not, what that means is that it's also your responsibility to end your oppression. And your oppression is not simply material and political and economic, as you'd put it. It's also psychic, it's also psychological, it's epistemic, and it's cultural.
Right.
And we have to end that. So so the first thing is we have a responsibility to end this, to fight against this, without knowing what the result will be in advance.
But the tragedy is that, and this is across the board, across the races, we're encountering a new generation of youth who are lazy to read, who don't want to read, who do not want to engage generally with thought, or with critical thought for that matter. And because they've seen how students have gone through the university system in the past, you know, the easy way through where tests and exams are repeated, etc., the minute you give them something different, something new, to challenge them, you find that even they then become obstacles to change.
Yeah, that's one of the most difficult things that a lot of black academic colleagues have experienced, which is they're trying to bring in decolonizing knowledge into the space, and they find that all students, black and white, are not interested or think this is too difficult or prefer the easy way out. A few things are important there. Firstly, all students want the easy way around. All young people want the easy way out. Okay, I don't think there's ever been a generation that read more than another. I do think social media and a certain new cultural and social context that people call a millennial context, the culture of instant gratification, etc., as people are trying to think about it, this fascination with the spectacular and the immediate, this love for quick results rather than slow, deep,
consistent effort,
consistent reflection. I think that new culture may be weakening our ability to reach students, but my experience in the classroom has always been that even if those students might not go and read 50 history books after listening to me, they have a deep concern about the world that they live in, and they are really fascinated by ideas. But I think it's all about neoliberal capitalism and just this idea of getting people to graduate, to make money, to be professionals, that might be destroying our ability to produce students with strong intellectual sensibilities. The other thing that comes out quite importantly out of all radical liberation movements is that the people themselves have to be educated in order to know why they're fighting, what they're fighting against, how to end it, what kind of world to bring into being. So education is absolutely a responsibility. And so I think we have to try and impress upon students the value of intellectual work. So I have found that if you can cultivate a relationship with a strong few students who you can take into the future as master students, doctoral students, and future academics and so forth, we should zoom in and seize that opportunity. But we shouldn't too quickly dismiss students.
Yeah.
Because I think young people also have all kinds of weird social, sexual, personal, familial pressures, and they're also coming into a very new world.
And this is about a level of maturity. It develops. It's almost like, taste for food or whatever. It takes time to get
over
into
time.
that.
Our job is to patiently convince not only young people in the university, but the public. That reading and thinking and debate and literature and theory is not just for a few of us in the academy, it's for all of us. It's about the world of ideas, the ideas that we need to construct a new future. And in fact, some people are suggesting that the biggest crisis in the university now is that people don't want ideas anymore, they just want quick results. And it's not just students, I have to say. The pressure placed by management and senior academics for people to simply churn out research that has no value, that has no social depth, that's not well worked out, simply so that you can get a high rating as a university or so you can get a government subsidy, is producing a very perverse relationship to the academy.
But
so it's not just the young people.
Yeah, but that's exactly the problem then, isn't it? If for as long as we're chasing after ratings, then we're not pursuing the project of decolonization, because decolonization is about making it relevant. Ratings is about just doing it for the sake of doing it.
And if you think about decolonization together with all these other terms of radical change, liberation, in the US the phrase abolition, decolonization isn't just changing what the university values. It's changing the very idea that the university has to value things and rank things and weigh things and approach things in an instrumental fashion. It's imagining a world perhaps even without the university as we know it, but where spaces of learning are radically democratized and open to everybody.
Well, it's already started. I mean, if you look at some of the colleges that are online now, which is free, I think there's one related to the Khan Academy or something like that. I was reading about it recently, where they're offering free online courses, and in South Africa they've taken the first 200 candidates or whatever for a particular course. Yeah.
There are some risks with that, because I think it's also trying to cheapen education. I still believe in the classroom. And whether
the contact,
right. Well, the classroom, whether the classroom is home, or it's a formal lecture hall, or it's a community center, or anyway, I still believe in the classroom and human beings engaging in dialogue. All philosophical engagement is about dialogue, it's about facing. So I'm worried about that. What I have in mind is the fact that we really have in South Africa and across the world now, young people on Twitter and elsewhere trying to develop critical knowledge that's quickly accessible. And young people writing books that are also publicly accessible on very topical, deep issues about our history and about our society. And so I think the bind that we are currently in the university is, how do you decolonize a neoliberal university? In other words, how do you decolonize a university that for the most part accepts that South African universities or universities in the global south need the recognition of universities in the global north? I mean, if you go to the United States or the UK, they don't have these anxieties about being international, because they are the international.
They are the center of the international.
They are the center of the international, right? We must always supplicate and try and prove our relevance to an outside world.
How do you break free from that?
Well, slowly but surely, I think we need a new cadre of academics, or the current cadre of academics, to really take seriously our responsibility to transform the university, whatever that means. It's going to be a struggle, it's going to be difficult, but it's also exciting.
Yes, of course.
I think we should. Writing this doctorate was exciting. It wasn't scary. It was exciting.
It's embracing something powerful.
Absolutely. It was looking for gaps. It was trying to really find the deepest level at which to engage the problem of race and colonialism in South Africa, and trying to show how our whole understanding of freedom and social change is completely wrong, and it's to the detriment of the black majority.
There is as they say, there's fallacies that they spread about many of these thinkers, and one of that is that thinkers like Biko, for example, would not accept another race, for example, would not accept white people, and this creates division in a society. What do you tell the white people in South Africa, etc.? How do you respond to this? I mean, knowing that Biko was a humanist and that he was deeply concerned about the problems that face South Africa, and that it was a crying shame that people were distinguished according to their color, or are still being distinguished according to their color. How do we break down these stereotypes, these mindsets, these perceptions, if people are even lazy to read what Biko wrote?
Biko's problem, as I understand it, was not that people are categorized according to color. It was that people were being oppressed based on color. And that's a very important distinction. His problem wasn't that we're being labeled.
Right.
His problem was that his people were being oppressed. So So my thesis is not what would Biko have said. I don't know, and I think that's one of the most dangerous ways to engage our ancestors. It's the worst way to engage the living dead. We don't know. What I do know about Biko is that I don't think that the first problem for him would be convincing white people about anything.
Right. First is to free yourself, isn't it?
The first is for black people, being a black majority on the African continent, to take responsibility for their freedom and to come together to map out ways of changing their reality and changing their condition.
Okay, but we're at the end. I have to stop you there. If you want to give one last powerful point, please.
Well, I think for Biko, the most important thing is that it is not simply that black people must change, but that in the process of liberating black people, white people have the chance of also becoming free as well, if they're willing not simply to give up the label of whiteness, but also the position of being white, which means the position of being a part of or a beneficiary of a settler conqueror population that still has massive unethical amounts of social power in South Africa. And so I encourage people to continue reading and thinking and struggling.
That's a very, very powerful comment, Anton. But thank you very much. Thanks for sharing these ideas and these thoughts. And I would like to encourage people to go online and to search for your name and to read the stuff that you have put out there, especially for those who are very interested in critical thought and especially in race relations in South Africa. So thanks, Joel, for always contributing to this particular dialogue in a way that people can understand.
Thank you.
Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
قسما بالله رب العالمين وارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي